It's wonderful to be joined by Andy Murray this afternoon. Thank you, Andy, for talking with us. Andy is a deacon at Livingston Free Church, and he's also program manager for Safe Families in Scotland. And we're looking forward to talking to him about his faith and life, and also about Thomas Guthrie, a figure about whom Andy has written quite a bit. So Andy, before we get too serious, I note that one of your hobbies is the Highland game of shinty. And for the benefit of our viewing and listening audience, I wonder, could you explain to us what is shinty and how is it played?
Well, thank you for inviting me onto the podcast, Josh. It's great to be here. I don't suppose shinty has been discussed in the Banner of Truth before, but shinty is a game I grew up with when I was brought up in Oban. My boys, I've got 5 boys, so 3 of my boys play shinty regularly for Aberdour Shinty Club. It's a 12-a-side game played on grass with sticks. It can be a little rough at times. It's played with a small ball that's made of leather and cork. It's played in pockets around the country, but mainly in the Highlands. But there's a club in Fife that my boys are part of, and I'm the chaplain for that club, actually. So most Saturdays from about March to August, September, we are somewhere in the Highlands, sometimes on islands like Bute, beautiful places like Ardnamurchan, and the most beautiful place of all, Oban, watching and playing shinty. So
fantastic. And how long can you expect a shinty game to last?
So a shinty game is 90 minutes. It's not like football. You're in each other's half, so you mark your opponent. It's very much a one-on-one battle. So, and tends to be fairly high scoring. So, plenty of excitement. So,
wonderful. Well, if any of our viewers or listeners are ever in Scotland, in the Highlands, do make sure you get along to a shinty game. Yeah. Well, Andy, thank you so much for being with us. Could you tell us a bit about your background, where you grew up and how you came to faith in the Lord Jesus?
Yeah, so interestingly enough, my story, I suppose, in some ways is the story of the Banner of Truth, because my father was from the Highlands. He was from Sutherland. He was brought up in just outside Dornoch. My father, when he came to the Lord, began to devour Puritan writings, particularly Samuel Rutherford. And he moved to Edinburgh to be an insurance salesman. And he began to publish a small magazine called Eternal Truth in the late 1950s. And that was published and sent all over the world, and I think he published 10 editions of that magazine. But he came into contact with Ian Murray, who started the Banner of Truth, and Ian invited my dad down to London in 1960 to join the Banner of Truth and to become the editor of the magazine. And my dad stopped publishing Eternal Truth and began to work for the Banner, and he began to work on some of the early editions of many of the classics in the Banner of Truth, like the memoirs of Murray McShane and so on. And he met my mum, who was working in London in the mid-60s, and I was born in 1972 in London while my father was working for the Banner of Truth. And then the year after I was born, the Banner of Truth moved to the Grey House in Edinburgh. So I moved from London when I was 1 because the Banner moved. Otherwise, I'd be speaking to you with a broad London accent at the moment. So very glad that my dad moved up. And so just shortly after that, a few years after that, my father felt called to the ministry. He started studying in the Free Church College in Edinburgh, and he was called for his first charge to Oban in Argyll in 1978, and we enjoyed growing up in Argyll. We were very happy there as a family, but just 2 years after my father was in the ministry, tragedy struck, and my older sister developed a brain tumour and died in 1980, and that had a very profound effect on me. I realised at a very young age the fragility and brevity of life. My older sister Linda was a very strong Christian, so her faith had a very strong impact on me. And I vividly remember the funeral and the graveside, and I suppose almost peering into eternity had quite a profound effect on me. Probably my mid-teens, around about 14, I professed faith publicly. I remember in those days the elders having a very profound effect on me. One particular elder from the Highlands was a very, very quiet man, but when I started going to the prayer meeting, he would pray, and his prayers were like stepping into another world. He stepped into eternity as he prayed almost, and those prayers had a very profound effect on me. He was very moved in prayer. He often wept in public prayer. So around about 14 I became a member. I remember one of the elders taking me aside before I became a member, and he said to me, are you ready to take this very seriously? Are you going to commit to what they describe as the means of grace, the regular services, the preaching? Are you prepared to come out twice on a Sunday? Are you committed to the prayer meeting? And he said, if you're not, then don't become a member. And that's always stuck with me. I've always tried to stick to that. He encouraged me to read the Bible every day, to pray, and these very simple things have, I suppose, sustained me in my Christian life. But these things were very much expected in those days, and seem to have slipped away in our own time. But those were things that I was encouraged to take very seriously. So I became a Christian at quite a young age, and as I went on in my teens, I remember my dad moved to Edinburgh, and I was going to go to university in Aberdeen. And as I went to university, or every time I was about to go to a new term, my father would give me a new book. So I remember being given the memoirs of McShane. I remember being given the life of Andrew Bonar. I remember being given the life of Jonathan Edwards by Ian Murray. And every year my father would give me a new book. And I remember just a sort of, I suppose, a growing seriousness about my understanding of theology through these biographies. I wasn't a great reader of theology in those days, but those biographies had quite a profound effect on me. And I would say particularly the life of Andrew Bonar just gave you a glimpse into somebody who took their faith and their pursuit of God very, very seriously. And his diary is just full of his own reflections on his own sinfulness and his own need of grace on a daily basis, and that had a profound effect on me in my late teens and early 20s. So.
Excellent. That's fascinating. And you went to university, I believe, to study social work?
Yes, I went to Robert Gordon's to did a degree in social science, applied social science and social work.
So was that something you'd been planning towards for quite some time, or was it a late decision? And how did your studies at university impact the sort of the following decade of what you ended up doing?
Yeah, so when I left school, I worked for the Banner of Truth for a couple of summers. I went to work on a voluntary basis with the Edinburgh City Mission, really unsure what I wanted to do. I think looking back at my life, I suspect I was undiagnosed dyslexic. Didn't really have much of a passion for reading as a teenager. But as I left school and went to university, I discovered a passion for learning and for reading. Began to devour books because I was able to read in my own time and style, I think. So wasn't really sure what I wanted to do, but got into social work. Didn't really enjoy applied social science. Not entirely sure what that is to this day, but really enjoyed the social work side of things. Always loved people. So when I finished my degree, I got a job with Edinburgh City Council, working in a residential unit for young people who were suffering trauma and distress. So it was quite a steep learning curve. for somebody in their early 20s, but really enjoyed the work. Got real memories of. It was a secure unit, so that the children were they're either a danger to themselves or a danger to the community, or sometimes both. But I've got profound memories of some of these children still not being able to go home on Christmas Day, and opening presents with these kids who had no home to go to, really, or no safe home anyway. And I suppose it has given me a lifelong passion for justice, for giving people who haven't had a great start in life equal opportunity, and that has infused a lot of the work that I've done over the last 30 years. So.
And that's something that doesn't always go together with perhaps what we might call mainstream evangelical occupations. But in your life, the Lord, it seems, has woven these two great interests in a wonderful way, a passion for the church and for theology and for discipling, as well as a passion for justice. Why do you think these things sometimes don't gel, particularly in the church?
Yeah, it's a great mystery to me, because as we look back at the history of Christianity in Scotland, and particularly the history of the Free Church, these things did go together, and they went hand in hand. And yeah, it's a great mystery to me why people see that showing compassion to the poor, for example, is somehow a distraction from preaching the gospel, because the two go hand in hand. As we read the Bible, we see this emphasis right throughout the Bible of God's heart towards the poor, the marginalised, the widow, the orphan, the stranger. Much of many of the passages in Leviticus, for example, God attaches love towards the poor with his name. And, we see stories like Ruth in the Old Testament, where she came in as a widow with her mother-in-law. She was defenceless, she was penniless, but yet the covenant community welcomed her in based on the Levitical law, and allowed her to glean the barley in the harvest fields, so that she had the dignity to work, and she received protection, and she received hospitality. And much of the work that I've been doing over the last few years has been around encouraging Christians to open their homes and to show hospitality to those who are marginalised. I think we've redefined hospitality as inviting our friends from church over, whereas the Bible talks about hospitality as inviting over the stranger and the widow and the orphan. And James, in his book in the Bible, obviously famously says that pure and undefiled religion before the Lord is to visit widows and orphans in their need, and that's what we are called to do as the church, I think.
That's really, really helpful. Now, you've focused in particular in recent years on a figure from church history, from Scottish and Free Church history, who combined both zeal for the gospel with a real concern for the poor. And amazingly, when he died, there were 30,000 people who turned out for his funeral, and yet I'm sure many of our viewers and listeners may not have even heard his name. But tell us a bit about Thomas Guthrie. How did you first discover him? And how has he shaped your own thinking and Christian life?
Yeah, so Thomas Guthrie was born in 1803. He was born up in Angus, in Brechin. And Thomas Guthrie was a bit like Thomas Chalmers. He was good at many things. He was an incredible orator. He was involved in politics. He was a social philanthropist. He could have turned his hand to anything, really. but as I've said in some of my writings, he, at a very early age, seemed to be moved by a sense of injustice for the poor. He was forever taking up the cause of the oppressed. He was very against slavery, which wasn't particularly popular in the 19th century, but he spoke out very strongly against slavery. He had a rural charge in Arburloch in Angus from 1830 to 1837, but when he was called to Old Grey Friars in 1837 in Edinburgh, he was horrified by what he saw in the city. There was an estimate of perhaps 1,000 to 2,000 street children in Edinburgh. Many of them came from homes where they were thrown out into the streets to fend for themselves. There were young girls prostituting themselves. The boys were maybe selling matches, doing what they could to survive. But the big problem in Guthrie's day in the 1830s and 40s was drunkenness. There were these gin palaces in the Victorian era. There were the dram houses, and drunkenness was a huge issue. And as Guthrie sought to pastor the Cowgate in Edinburgh, he systematically visited the neighbourhood and was distraught with what he saw on a day-to-day basis, at the effects of drunkenness and the poverty that it caused, and the abuse that it caused towards women and children in particular. And at this time, Guthrie was following Chalmers's vision for what was called the parochial system. So that was this vision that they had for Scotland, that the nation was to be Christianised really street by street. So Guthrie, even though he was called to Old Grey Friars in the Old Town, he planted a church within maybe 80 yards of his church in Victoria Street, and St John's in Victoria Street was almost like a model church. So it was a church that didn't charge pew rents to the poor, which was very common in those days. Pew rents were gathered by the local council to pay the stipends of ministers. But when Guthrie planted St John's in 1830, the church was open to everybody. And the other thing about Guthrie was, again in line with Chalmers, was his elders and deacons weren't decision makers. They were active. They were given streets to visit systematically. They were given jobs to do. They created Sunday schools for children who were from a poor background. They opened parish schools, and they had this real vision for the parochial system, which was the Christianising of Scotland almost on a street-by-street basis. So when the disruption came along in 1843, you'd think that all that would have been disrupted, but in fact, in many ways, it was accelerated, and much of the work was accelerated.
So just for the benefit of our viewers and listeners, the disruption, in a nutshell, is a departure of some of the evangelical faction from the Church of Scotland due to church and state issues. Yeah. What did that result in immediately afterwards?
Yeah, so about 500 ministers and elders left the Church of Scotland in 1843, mainly over the establishment principle. So it was about state interference in the church, whether Christ is head of the church or whether the state is able to interfere in the affairs of the church. So there's many other issues, but that was the fundamental issue.
And lots was knocked out of whack, but not, you say, Guthrie and Chalmers's vision.
So by the early 1830s, there was 30s and 40s, there was a great vision for church planting, and that continued after the disruption. Guthrie became involved in the Manse Fund. So Guthrie was given leave to raise £100,000. He went on to raise £130,000 to build new manses for ministers that had to leave their manses in the disruption, and that had a tremendous effect on the cause of the gospel continuing. So Guthrie was an all-rounder. He was a great preacher, fantastic orator. He was a social reformer. He was a church planter, and he was a great leader. He was one of these great leaders in the disruption that people followed. He was a great writer, and he was able to rally people behind him. So later on, when he set up the Ragged Schools, he became known as the apostle of the temperance movement. So people rallied behind him as he spoke out against the evils of drunkenness in Victorian Scotland. He wrote pamphlets. He spoke at public meetings. So he was seen as a great figurehead and a great leader, and he was able to articulate causes, and people were able to get behind that. So.
That's fantastic, really helpful. Could we just drill down a little bit on the Ragged School movement for a second, because that was such an integral part of his work. Obviously, as you've said, he was an immensely talented man who saw that the causes of poverty were various and attempted to help the poor and needy in various ways. But could you tell us briefly what the Ragged School movement was about, and some of the legacy of that in the decades even after his death?
Yeah, so Guthrie was born in 1803 and he died in 1873, and I think one of the points that I make in the little book I wrote about Guthrie was that by the time Guthrie had died, he had literally changed childhood. You know, at the start of the 19th century, children would have been seen as objects. They would have been seen as disposable. They were sent up chimneys. They were used in factories. They were sleeping rough on the streets. Nobody saw their worth, really. But through theology, through preaching, through this movement, Guthrie literally, and many other social reformers like Shaftesbury, they changed childhood. And by the time Guthrie died, there was legislation to protect children, so that they received education, they received nurture, they received some degree of protection. And I believe that was largely, but not wholly, down to Christian social reformers who changed the view of society with regard to who children were and what children deserved. So the way that the Ragged Schools started was that the Guthrie wrote a book called A Plea for Ragged Schools. It was a pamphlet, really, and it went through 3 different editions that were finally put into one book. But Guthrie, in his memoirs, very famously says that he came back from the printers having handed over the manuscript, and he had his head in his hands. He said, "What have I done? You know, I've made a fool of myself. I've written this book. Nobody's going to listen to it. Nobody's going to read it." And very gradually, he describes it as a spark amongst combustibles that set off this fire that was unstoppable. And it was the sort of touch paper in a movement that just exploded into life. And very quickly there was the first Ragged School, which is up on Castle Hill beside where Camera Obscura is now. And Guthrie took in street children, and the children would have been in from 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning till 7 o'clock at night. They washed when they arrived. They received their breakfast. They received education. They received vocational training. So some of the boys would have been taught, joinery. Some of the girls would have been taught sewing, many of the girls would have been prepared to work in some of the wealthier homes as maids, for example, and there was simple biblical teaching. The children were taught, manners. They were taught rules. They were taught responsibilities. But interestingly enough, Guthrie was opposed to corporal punishment. He believed in what he called the almost omnipotent power of Christian kindness. And many of these children had been beaten in their own homes. And Guthrie was very clear when he was recruiting teachers. He wanted teachers that were kind to the children and could nurture them. That was what made these schools so radical.
And was he recruiting exclusively from the churches or predominantly from the churches? Or?
Yes,
yep.
He recruited exclusively from churches, but he was very clear that the Ragged Schools were interdenominational. So the committee that ran the Ragged Schools was interdenominational, and that was very deliberate on Guthrie's part. They had tried to start the Ragged Schools in Guthrie's church, but the elders had got cold feet at the last minute. And so Guthrie went out to the sort of wider Christian community to ask for help. And so he decided not to teach the shorter catechism, for example, in the schools. He wanted to make them a broadly Christian school, not a free church school, which was a little bit controversial at the time. But he wanted the children to receive basic Christian education. So they weren't taught in any particular convictions of the free church. They were taught broadly Christian principles. So the Ragged School took off very quickly. They spread around the country. The original Ragged School in Castle Hill eventually moved out to Liberton, and the girls' school moved to where the Faith Mission is now, to Gilmerton. And schools began to spread out all over the country. I believe there was a Ragged ship up in Dundee where the boys would be taught, how to be sailors. So there were different versions of Ragged schools all over the country. And of course, Lord Shaftesbury was very involved in the spread of Ragged schools in England. And many, many thousands of kids were saved from a life of crime and destitution and homelessness by these Ragged schools. And Guthrie talks about these reunions at Christmas time where these Ragged school children would come back, and they were married, they had jobs, and just how much pride he took in the work that had been done through these Ragged schools to reform children and to give them a place in society they would never have had before. So.
Mm-hmm. What a fantastic work! And do we have any sense as to whether or not the work that went on in these children's lives and hearts spread to their families and to their parents to any degree?
I think so. I think Guthrie had a very prayerful hope that these children would be missionaries to their parents. He quite often spoke about that. He's got a very famous story in Out of Harness where he talks about a blind beggar, and he talks about how he went to his house in the midst of squalor, and he said he suddenly came across this flat where there was it was clean and swept, and it wasn't grand, but it was very modest. But he said that grace had come to this home, and that this man would go out, and I think he'd play his accordion to raise money because he was blind. But he spoke about the homes that he would go to where families had received the gospel and drunkenness had been put away, for example, and thrift had come into the home and they were using what little money they had wisely. So Guthrie, I think, did see some effects from the Ragged schools of it spreading to parents and to the home.
Wonderful. As we sort of come into land now, could you tell us a bit about what you've been doing to spread the word about Guthrie's legacy, and maybe say a word also to the issue of how Guthrie might speak to us today. We find ourselves in quite a different day and age in some respects, and yet we also have very similar issues still with us. How do you see Guthrie speaking as a prophetic voice to the church of the 21st century in Scotland and in the UK?
So just your first question was what I've done to raise Guthrie's profile. So I've written this, I wrote this booklet in 2013. It was a series of articles in the Free Church Record. And just around that time, I also started a blog called Ragged Theology, where I've written many articles on Guthrie's legacy. I think I should say, one of the tragedies of the Guthrie schools was that they continued, I think, until the 1980s in some form or another. But like many of these residential schools, there have been many allegations made against them of abuse, and Guthrie would have been appalled that some of these schools had descended into abusive situations, and there are people around today who were the victims of that abuse, which is a real tragedy. But in terms of Guthrie's legacy, I quite often, when I speak about Guthrie, I say, when you look at his statue in Princess Street Gardens, where thousands of people walk past that statue every week, and nobody has any idea who he is. So my current office is very close to his statue, and I think it's so sad in Castle Street in Edinburgh that Thomas Chalmers and Thomas Guthrie look at each other up Castle Street, and all these cars, and people walk past them both without any idea who they are, and completely ignorant of the fact that these were giants in civic and church life in Scotland in the past. But Guthrie's statue he has his arm round what's called a ragged child, so an orphan, and his other hand is holding a Bible. And to me, that is an image of the church, that we are called to proclaim truth and show love, and we must never get the two out of sync. And that is why I appreciate Guthrie so much, is because he held orthodoxy and he preached the gospel so faithfully, but he also displayed love so tenderly and compassionately, and he gave his life to being a voice for the voiceless. And I think the same issues that Guthrie was battling with are the issues of our day. So we have a huge issue with addiction in Scotland. I was chatting to somebody this morning, and we think we have a great problem with drugs and drug deaths, but alcohol deaths are almost as high as drug deaths now. The issue of alcohol in terms of domestic abuse in Scotland is a national scandal. The numbers of children entering care have been coming down over the last 10 years, but we still have between 9,000 and 10,000 children in care in Scotland. We have brought in many good systems in Scotland, in my opinion, in terms of prevention and early intervention. My own charity, Safe Families, is part of that. But so many families are still suffering from neglect, and the epidemic of our age, I think, is social isolation. I think so many people are socially isolated, and so much of the fabric of our society in the past has gone. And I think, like Guthrie, I think that the answer is the local church, showing the love of Christ in a very practical way, and proclaiming the gospel in a local context. I often say when I'm speaking at churches, if a family was in crisis in your neighbourhood, where would they go? Would they go to the council? Would they go to the community centre? Or would they come here to the church? is this a hospital of grace for people who are broken by sin? And I think in Guthrie's day, what Guthrie did was he offered that hospital of grace to the poor, to the marginalised, to the addicted. The good news of the gospel was attainable because Guthrie planted in such poor areas, and he put his congregation to work to make contact with everyone in that community. And my fear is that so often our churches are places that are not accessible to people who are in the margins of our society. They hardly even know that they're there. So I think Guthrie's great legacy is a model of biblical and social and community engagement, that as we engage with our communities, as we help people in poverty, as we help people who are lonely, it doesn't mean that we're selling out the gospel. I think gospel proclamation and love for the marginalised can go hand in hand.
Well, I think that's a wonderful challenge and note on which to finish. So I want to thank you, Andy, for being with us, for sharing a bit about you and your ministry, and also about Thomas Guthrie, who showed an incredible example of following in Christ's footsteps and living a life of truth and love, which will be of help to all who hear, I think. Just to say, if people want to find out more about you, Ragged Theology is online and can be found. You also maintain thomasguthrie.org, is that correct?
Yeah, so thomasguthrie.org is a website where you'll find a lot of information about Thomas Guthrie, and then Ragged Theology is my blog, so I write about lots of different issues on my blog, from sort of leadership to Christian issues, and some stuff about Guthrie as well. Fantastic.
And I would also signpost our listeners and our viewers to listen to Andy reading his article, Thomas Guthrie, Preacher and Philanthropist, which just came out last week. So do check that out. Thanks once again, Andy, for being with us.
Thank you for having me.